Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran. I'm the director of Enlighten. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is a joint production between Enlighten and our friends at Policywise. Our subject today is public opinion in Wales and Scotland as the devolved elections in both nations draw ever closer, with potentially exciting, somewhat transformative results. Policywise have commissioned exclusive polling from More in Common, the results of which we shall hear about shortly. I'm just going to keep my remarks short at the moment. We have an excellent cross-nation panel of policy, polling and academic experts to discuss what it might all mean. We have Professor Nicola McEwen, Professor of Public Policy and Governance and Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. We have Charlie Buckley, a researcher at More in Common, and we have Dewi Knight, who's the Director of Policywise. How it's going to work is Dewi's going to give us some opening remarks, then Charlie is going to do a presentation of the polling data, and then Nicola will give her initial thoughts, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about it all. Very keen to hear your questions, as ever, so if you want to submit those using the chat function on Zoom, we'll try and take as many as we can before the hour is up. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Dewi.
Thanks, Chris, and Prynhawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. As Chris said, I'm just going to quickly set the scene for our discussions. I'm just going to briefly share why we've polled voters in Scotland and Wales on their attitudes towards policy, cooperation and intergovernmental relations, and what, for me and us at Policywise, are the key themes and findings from this survey that More in Common conducted on our behalf. So firstly, the why. As Chris said, with the Holyrood and Senedd elections just 73 days away, we can expect to see the most disruptive elections of the democratic devolution era so far. Therefore, we thought it was academically and politically imperative to learn what are the similarities and the differences between the two nations when it comes to the public's policy priorities for their next governments. How do they think that devolved and UK governments are working together at the moment? How should governments cooperate? Are there specific issues where the public expects to see cross-nation cooperation? And how do they perceive the effectiveness of intergovernmental working and of our individual governments? At Policywise, we've been researching these issues and doing our bit to enable better policy learning across administrations for the past couple of years, as well as examining the practical and structural ways to improve intergovernmental relations. So, what are the main couple of themes from the polling, which is now available on our website and which we'll hear more details from Charlie in a minute? Firstly, the public in both Scotland and Wales are sending a clear message to the Westminster government and to whoever wins May's elections. Stop falling out with each other and making it even more difficult to tackle the major policy issues. You need to work together on the public's priorities in Scotland and Wales, such as the cost of living, supporting the NHS and immigration. The public in both nations wants to see their governments cooperate on devolved and reserved issues. We need to see a bit of give and take when it comes to sharing policy responsibilities across administrations. Secondly, a majority in both countries believe that their devolved governments could work well with Westminster, but are not doing so currently. This is important because the public knows that no one governing authority in the UK, including the Westminster government, can achieve their priorities alone. So just lastly, our leaders and our ministers across our governments need to cooperate and coordinate action in areas of common interest. Our polling shows it's what the public expects and it's what the public deserves in both Scotland and Wales.
All right, and Charlie.
Thank you. Thanks, Stu. Thanks, Chris. I will share my screen now. I hope this will show up for everybody. Okay. Thanks, Dewey, for that introduction. So, as he says, we've conducted polling in both Scotland and Wales. These were separate polls. I've got some basic information up here for any of you who are particularly wonky about polling and want to know more about our methodology. Um, you can throw any questions you have at me at the end, or of course reach out to us. Um, but some basic details are there. We conducted this earlier in the month. So the results are very fresh and very relevant to the upcoming elections in both countries. Um, so one starting point, which I would like to jump off with in when talking about any issues, including intergovernmental relations, is that how the public themselves understand the main challenges facing the country. Um, and in Scotland and in Wales, and quite similarly to Britain overall, things like independence are fairly low on the agenda for most voters, including, as I'll get to later on, people who intend to vote for nationalist parties in Wales and Scotland. Priorities for everybody are, generally speaking, the cost of living, the NHS, immigration, depending on which voter you're talking to, and then some other issues like crime and housing, um, always flare up, and we track these things over time, especially in Britain overall, and these stay fairly consistent. Immigration has been climbing in the last 2 years, but otherwise, cost of living and the NHS are top issues everywhere. Um, and this is just important context to keep in mind when we think about what issues people in Scotland and Wales want their governments to cooperate with Westminster more on. Um, so just to start with, at the moment, as Dewey said, the perception is that in Scotland and Wales is that their governments are not working well with Westminster. But crucially, this is not something that they believe is entirely intractable or can never be resolved. When we ask people whether they think their governments will be able to work well with Westminster, the public consistently, you see in both countries, reject the idea that it's impossible and they think that it is entirely doable. It's just not happening at the moment. Um, and similarly, when asking about devolution more broadly, and this is something we do regularly in all of our polling in Scotland and Wales, um, voters in Scotland are a little bit more bullish on devolution as to whether it's been beneficial for them. But in neither country do people want to wind back the clock. Um, they both think, and they both think that their devolved governments, for better or worse, have served them better than the government of Westminster does. So onto the issue of intergovernmental relations itself. A lot of devolved issues for both the Scottish and Welsh governments. The public are supportive of the idea that they should work closer with Westminster on them. This is fairly consistent across Scotland and Wales, although you will see the NHS being a slightly bigger priority for people in Wales. The problems there are known. Um, Reducing poverty as well. But broadly, it's a similar trend across all of these key devolved issues. Um, a good chunk, at least a third, will say that working with Westminster is essential for making progress. Depending on the issue, another 10 to 20% will say it's helpful, but not essential. Very few, even among supporters of nationalist parties, will say that working with Westminster gets in the way of making progress on things like the NHS, education, housing, and so on. Um, so similarly, with reserved issues for Westminster, people in Scotland and Wales would like to have more be consulted more on decisions that are made in them. Again, you see some slight variation between the two countries. In Wales, immigration is a bit more salient. Um, in both countries, energy is a big concern, and Scots are also marginally more likely to want to have a say in relations with the EU. So, yes, and similarly, this is the same, essentially the same list as the question we asked at the beginning about what people think their top issues are. Um, Again, in Wales, where the NHS is a bit more of a concern for voters, they think that they're even more likely to think that their government should be working closer with Westminster to make progress. In both countries, the economy is a top priority. Um, and we also asked about tackling violence in women and girls, which I know is a policy priority at the moment, and that in a few cases actually considers more of a important thing to work with Westminster on than something like education. Um, so I'm going to talk briefly about why we see why these countries, Wales and Scotland, tend to align on a lot of these things, maybe more than you might expect. Um, there are some reasons behind that, which I'll get to. And a lot of it comes down to the types of voter that have coalesced around nationalist parties, as well as reform in both Scotland and Wales. They're quite different, but on some issues, this means that the countries overall tend to have similar views. Um, but firstly, we did ask this question about uh, whether the public think it's a good idea to be working with regional English governments as well, or even instead of the Westminster government. Um, and I think the takeaway from this is that it's still quite an unfamiliar concept to a lot of voters. A lot of them say don't know, but particularly among Reform voters in both countries, they would much prefer to see their devolved governments working with Westminster rather than with regional English authorities. Um, but so the party breakdowns are a useful way to explain why the results sometimes are different in different countries and why attitudes to um, intergovernmental relations vary. Um, so the one important takeaway, I think, is that Reform voters in Wales and Reform voters in Scotland are quite different. Reform voters in Wales are, for the most part, quite similar to Reform voters that we see in England, and that we at More in Common have been talking about for a long time, especially since the 2024 general election. The new people that Reform have brought into their coalition is a much broader range of voters than the kind of hardcore anti-immigration cohort, which people might be more familiar with. There are people who are disillusioned with Tory and Labour governments, feel like they've been let down by the major parties across the spectrum, and Reform are seen as the only credible alternative. In Wales, Reform voters are unionist, which should be expected. But one crucial thing is in Scotland, it's a little bit different. I feel like this may be the wrong order of slides, actually. Yes, this. So Reform voters. Is this the right one? Yes, it is. So Reform voters in Scotland, unlike in Wales, are not as unionist, and in fact, Reform have picked up a number of voters who had previously voted for the SNP in 2014, had voted for independence, and so this means that the coalition of voters that Reform has cobbled together in Scotland is a bit broader, and their attitudes towards Westminster will be a bit more mixed than they might be in Wales. Where I think if we have any Reform attitudes in Wales which are hostile or adversarial to the government in Westminster, that's mostly because it's currently a Labour government. Whereas in Scotland, I think this um, uh, attitude might also be coloured by, at least among some Reform voters, a preference for independence, or at least stronger devolution away from Westminster. Um, An important thing to bear in mind, though, is that independence is less and less of a top priority for people in Scotland, especially since the last general election. Even among SNP voters themselves, and we've conducted a lot of focus groups in Scotland, especially in the last few months, and even SNP voters will tell us that independence will be a nice to have, but it's really not their priority at the moment. Going back to what I talked about at the beginning, people are more immediately concerned about bringing their bills down, making the NHS more functionable, and again, depending on a certain type of voter, concern for immigration, ones that haven't already defected to reform. We asked about how First Ministers should approach Westminster, and the framing here was either standing up to Westminster or working constructively with them. And this is one case where you can see the clear difference between our Reform voters in Scotland and our Reform voters in Wales. Our Reform voters in Scotland are much more pro-working with Westminster, whereas our Reform voters in Wales, again, I think this is coloured by the current Labour government. Uh, they lean towards or are more likely to say that they would like their First Ministers to stand up to Westminster. It should be said that in both countries, this idea of having a totally adversarial relationship between the devolved governments and Westminster is not especially popular. Even among SNP voters, you'll see that only a third of them will take this view. And similar story with Plaid, they tend to lean towards having a more balanced approach, or even working more constructively with Westminster than they do at the moment. I don't think if there's anything I haven't covered. So I think that might be the gist of it for now. We do have, as Dewey said, we do have more detailed results on their website, and I can take any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you very much for that, Charlie. And now to Nicola for some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks to Policywise for inviting me to, and to Enlighten for inviting me to join this webinar. Now, I think this is an absolutely fascinating survey, very rich. Still working my way through interpreting the data. In some respects, it confirms what we thought was this, that you hear in engagement with people all the time, is this hunger for governments to work together, to set aside differences, to roll sleeves up and collaborate to resolve some issues. So very strong support for that across the political spectrum, including from SNP voters and Plaid Cymru voters in Wales, on a whole host of issues that are both devolved issues and that are reserved issues. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. And I think one of the things for me that is really interesting about the survey is that it suggests an electorate that is really quite sophisticated, and it doesn't subscribe to the view that is often articulated by some parliamentarians and some governments, and perhaps the prevalent view within the UK government, that there are issues that are reserved and that there are issues that are devolved, and the reserved issues are for the UK Parliament and the devolved issues for the Scottish Parliament, with UK government engagement as well. And even where that might be the case in law, it has never been the case in practice, because there's always been an interdependence between reserved and devolved issues. And I think what this survey is revealing is that the electorate gets that and appreciates that, and understands that you need to manage that interdependence, and you need to manage the influences that one set of decisions might have on another. There was one really interesting question, and I don't want to over-interpret it, it's quite a complex question, but it was asked people to think about devolved issues and what are the best reasons for the devolved governments to work more closely with the other with Westminster government and the other governments. And it wasn't about, the answers suggest that it wasn't predominantly about sharing lessons or even working on shared outcomes. The answers suggested quite territorially motivated concerns. So advancing Scottish or Welsh interests, and being mindful of the influence of Westminster policies on Scotland and Wales. Those two, I think, were the most prominent responses, which I thought was really interesting because it taps into what in political science terms we talk about as shared rule. So self-rule, self-government is what we often associate with devolution, with the Scottish Parliament, with the Welsh Senedd, being able to do things for themselves. But shared rule is about where there is recognition of that interdependence, and you need to be able to influence or have a say and have a voice in those UK-wide decisions that affect things that are devolved. And I think this survey in various different points reveals a recognition of that among the public, which I think is really, really interesting. It was mentioned there about the low salience of constitutional issues and of independence, particularly in Scotland, and that's confirming that what we've seen in various other surveys. There's some interesting things, though, in this survey, which would suggest that it might be one would be cautious about being complacent about that. So in both Scotland and Wales, more people thought that the Westminster government had been bad for them than good for them, good for Scotland, good for Wales. And a plurality in both Wales and Scotland thought that the UK government was mostly a government for England rather than for the UK as a whole. So that, particularly in the context of when there is a Labour government, I think that should perhaps be a little bit of a cause for concern if that is the prevalent attitude among the public. Final thought for now is that it's really interesting to see the similarities in attitudes among the electorate in Scotland and Wales. I would love to know what the electorate in England thought, and also what was the perception of the appropriate role of the UK government, because it may be that English attitudes are similar to those in Scotland or Wales, or it may be that it's just not seen as an issue, or it may be that there is actually a constraining factor there in how much the UK government might be able to engage devolved governments in areas that might be seen as theirs and theirs alone. So how much influence is an English electorate and English politics able to afford to Scotland and Wales before that becomes perhaps an area of political tension as well. And we're talking a lot here about expectations of the devolved governments after the election and how much they engage in the attitudes and the approach that they take to engagement with the UK government. But as in any relationship, it takes two to tango. And there needs to be some thinking, I think, about what we would like to see and what perhaps changes in approach and attitudes we might want to see from the UK government and their approach to the devolved governments as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I suppose I'd like to just start on this issue of collaboration, cooperation on both devolved and reserved issues. And I'm interested in what's happening to public opinion. I mean, in Scotland, which I can talk about with a degree of authority, we've been through an incredibly adversarial decade or so, obviously based around the constitutional question. I think there's been a bit more collaboration maybe in the Welsh Parliament than there has been in the Senedd, I should say, than there has been at Holyrood. And we know that Westminster is specifically designed to be adversarial. There's no surprise about that. But I just wonder why the public are now, because we talk about it a lot in the policy world about the need for collaboration if we're actually going to tackle some of these big issues, especially in the devolved parliaments with their voting systems and maybe lack of majorities, etc. Has the public view of the need for collaboration grown, do you think, as, to put it broadly, the world has become more serious, as the intractability of the problems that our society is facing has become more obvious. I mean, you know, they were all picking up the cudgels over identity culture wars and say constitutional issues, and are they starting to put them down because actually the world is just too worrying to be as adversarial previously, and that puts them a bit ahead of the politicians, perhaps. Dewi, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris. And to take forward Nicola's point, I think the public is ahead of our ministers and politicians on this issue. So day to day, in policy wise, we work a lot with officials right across our governments who want to cooperate on these big societal challenges, but they can only go as far as their ministers and politicians allow them. And they are perhaps a bit further behind on that concept of shared rule and collaborative governance than the public expectations are. And I think it's the sort of mild criticism there for Nicola about how we frame the relationships on expectations devolved versus Westminster is well made. And I think it is, if we look beyond May, you know, I think there might be a landing space there. We have more settled politics in Scotland and Wales. There might be, you know, different types of governments. I think it's then incumbent on the UK government to perhaps show a bit of flexibility in how it might want to engage and recognise that it should bring the devolved governments into its confidence on some of these big sort of issues, such as whether it's immigration, trade deals, relationships with the EU. I think the polling shows that the public in Scotland and Wales do expect their governments, their devolved governments, to play a part in influencing UK government thinking on this. But I don't think the politicians or leaders in Whitehall are quite there yet. And I think they want, especially those unionist politicians, need to think about that in the concept of the future of the union and how they're going to work with what looks very likely to be two nationalist-led governments in Scotland and Wales. And of course, you have a nationalist First Minister in Northern Ireland as well.
Nicola, what would you say to that? Obviously, it's, as Dewi says, having these three nationalist-led governments is going to pose something of a challenge and perhaps suggest a more oppositional politics rather than less. So how do we get the politicians to a place where we can actually get some stuff done together and with mutual respect and understanding? Is that a pipe dream?
So first of all, Dewi, it wasn't meant to be a mild criticism. I think the survey is great. I think it's so I think there is a window. I agree with that. There's a window of opportunity, if you like, after the election, assuming there's no early general election in the UK, which is a big assumption, but and that's part of the issue, isn't it? We're never far away from an election, and I think in the year to 18 months after the last general election, when Labour was elected, there was a change, there was a shift, and I think it's important to acknowledge that relationships between the UK government and devolved governments did improve during that time. The closer you get to an election, the harder that becomes, because you're not just two governments, but you are parties of government that are in competition. And personalities obviously shape these things too. But I think for probably, a couple of years after the election, there is a recognition, there is an opportunity to recognize that if any of the governments want to achieve and make progress on their big policy challenges, pretty much all of them are ones that span devolved and reserved responsibilities in Scotland and Wales. So they will, if they want to make progress, they will have to find ways to cooperate. And I suppose I would put a challenge to the SNP government in Scotland as well, that having good and effective intergovernmental relations doesn't mean that you're shoring up the union. It just means that you're getting stuff done. And, regardless of the constitutional relationship between Scotland and the rest of these islands, you would have to have positive, constructive relationships for collaborating on things that don't respect constitutional boundaries. So I suppose there are challenges to not just to the UK government, but to the devolved governments too.
I think one of the arguments that Scottish Labour have been making, I mean, it's not really borne out in the polls, unfortunately for them, is that having a Labour government in Scotland as well as a Labour government at Westminster would make for smoother sailing for both, because they would be more likely to work together. Now, obviously, since the general election, we've had a Labour government at Westminster and a Labour government in Wales. How has that worked out, Dewi?
Well, the proof has been in the pudding about the partnership in power, as Keir Starmer called it. And Charlie may correct me on the figures here, but I think there's a higher percentage of voters in Wales than in Scotland who think the relationship is not working well at the moment, despite having the same party in power. And I think Eluned Morgan has made great efforts to almost distance herself, but also to try to be constructive. And it's very difficult to hold those two imposters at the same time. So I can see it's very difficult for Anas Sarwar in Scotland, particularly following his intervention a couple of weeks ago. That's a very difficult card for them to play. I think it's quite interesting that if we think about these concepts of shared rule and sort of concurrent responsibility around issues, what really struck me in terms of what came across in the findings and how a party like Labour may position itself is that the public in both Scotland and Wales think that the UK government, as Nicola said, acts as the government for England, but then it thinks it doesn't communicate that it does that. So they almost think there's some sort of conspiracy of silence around this, where the public knows that they're in effect mainly the domestic government for England, but that we use the term the English imaginary in the academic study of this sort of reticence to use the word England to describe England. And I think that's something for sort of British parties or those in power in Westminster to really think about. The public is ahead of them on these issues, and don't be clear in your responsibilities, which I think then allows for better cooperation and coordination on issues, as opposed to almost having this, well, we are a unionist party or government for the whole of the UK, when the public sort of understands, well, on a lot of issues you aren't, but you don't say that. And I think that's the next stage of this respect and being genuine about sort of collaborative governance and shared rule.
And Nicola, I think maybe just coming back to Scotland on that issue, you mentioned, responsibility on the SNP to help get things done by working with Westminster rather than just viewing it as a zero-sum game, if you like. But, in our experience, when the SNP is doing well, independence as a campaign is never far from the headlines. And although it's not necessarily a voter priority now, I think John Swinney, especially given recent polling, putting the SNP creeping a little bit closer to an overall majority, will find himself in a position, if he's to get that majority, where the precedent of the Salmond era has been fulfilled, where his, the process he set out, which was for the SNP to get an overall majority, that would then entitle them to a second referendum. Do you think that in that event that sort of independence debate will be back with knobs on, and how does that work with a public that do have these other priorities and are a bit fatigued by the whole constitutional back and forth?
I think it would obviously depend on how on what John Swinney, assuming he was re-elected as First Minister, was to do with that, the approach that he would take and the response that he would get. But the constitutional question, we now know for sure, following the Supreme Court ruling a few years back, will have to have the consent of the Westminster Parliament, both to hold a referendum and to act upon the result of that if it was to result in a yes vote. So you would need to have a positive, cooperative relationship to see any of that through, or it just won't happen. And yes, that might, lead to sort of more political debate and grandstanding, but it doesn't get you very far if your objective is that sort of profound constitutional change. But I think whoever is the next government, I think the voters will probably make sure that they are also mindful of other issues, and take John Swinney's often talked about eradicating child poverty as one of the core priorities of the Scottish government. That's not something the Scottish government or Scottish Parliament can do on its own. And there was a survey question, and what was one of the areas that was asked about in your survey, and there was clear recognition of that and a wish for the governments to work collaboratively on those sorts of issues. So that's not easy. It's not easy to do. It's not because they sometimes come at these things differently, or even where you want the end goal, you might want to go about it in a different way. But I think there are even if the SNP is re-elected with the majority, it's not we are not in 2011 territory here. So challenges all around.
Indeed. And Dewi, it looks, according to the polls, like Plaid are going to be the largest party in the Senate. And one of the things this survey shows is that both in Scotland and Wales, the public generally think that the Westminster governments have not been good for them. So where does that leave Wales in terms of its own constitutional argument with a nationalist party in power and a population that's fairly disenchanted with what's happening in Westminster?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, I just looked back over some of the data. I think more reform voters in Wales think Westminster's been a bad thing for Wales than the UK, than has been a good thing, which is quite interesting in terms of the wider context of those views, as Charlie set out. Even though Conservative voters think Westminster rule has been a good thing for Wales more than has been a bad thing. That's quite interesting analysis there in terms of the type of reform voters. I think if we look at a genuine sort of pan-UK approach on these issues, I think SNP and Plaid are sister parties. They have been looking to sort of engage more over recent times. So I think that would be an interesting space if both governments want to move forward on key domestic agendas and recognise that cooperation with the Northern Ireland Executive, Westminster Government and regional authorities in England is not in opposition to whatever their constitutional advancement might be, because that is the public's expectation. So in terms of the broad similarities and what our polling shows, cost of living is the biggest issue that both voters in Scotland and Wales want their new governments to grapple with. Well, that's a combination of macroeconomic policies on inflation, macro taxation, trade deals and so on. But of course, there's so much devolved issues there in terms of housing costs, childcare costs, public services costs. So if the public is looking to reward those parties, SNP and Plaid, then they can't deliver on those acting alone. They need to find a way where they can work with the UK government on those. So there is, I think, clearly shared similarities, but also opportunities for two nationalist-led governments for them to work together with each other and with the other governments of these islands.
And in terms of how that happens, the landing space that we talked about, which is maybe a political opportunity, but then there's systemic arrangements that ensure that they do actually work together and it is done respectfully and that they are involved in each other's conversations. Both Nicola and Dewi, I'd be interested to hear from your thoughts about whether we have that system in place at the moment, and if not, what needs to change to try and incentivise closer working. Nicola.
So we have a system in place. The question is whether it's working to support that, and there's a lot of variation in different types of policy area. So it works better in some cases than in others. I do think one of the structural challenges is within Whitehall itself, and it goes back to that point about when it recognises itself as governing for England or governing for the UK, and I don't think there is self-recognition there much at all, and that does pose a challenge so even where you have intergovernmental forums where the governments might work together. We saw this in the case of recycling glass stuff, deposit return scheme, that's the phrase I was looking for. So where, in a particular intergovernmental forum, the governments might think they have got to a place, and then it goes into the Whitehall machinery towards getting an agreement, and then something comes back eventually that is a little bit different. So that there's something not quite right in the way that Whitehall functions that has not quite adapted to devolution yet, and I think that's one of the challenges. Chris, can I come back to another point that, because it's raising an issue from the chat that Stefan R asked about, and asked how the data indicating public desire for cooperation lines up with data from elsewhere about standing up for Wales, and we see some things, similar things in terms of standing up for Scotland, and a real hunger and desire for the devolved governments to stand up for their interests. And that was going to the point that I was trying to say at the beginning, which I think is so fascinating that's come out of this survey, is that is for many people, and for the majority in the Scottish case, I've got the survey open here, that's why they want them to engage and cooperate in intergovernmental relations. So, you know, asked about the reasons for cooperation, the majority in the Scottish case say to make sure Scotland's interests are taken into account. So these things are not opposites at all. But I think it's a really sophisticated insight, I think, from the public as to how you stand up for Scotland or Wales.
If I could just, so add to what Nicola was saying, Stefan, to your point, I think if in another poll people said that they would like their government or the Welsh government to stand up for Wales more, that doesn't necessarily mean to stand up to Westminster, but rather to just represent Welsh interests, which you could argue that Plaid would be taking a more adversarial stance towards Westminster, but I don't think that's necessarily how voters see it. They just see it as something that would, as a party which would articulate a country's interests different from England or Britain overall, and so advancing their own interests. Again, with like cost of living being a top issue for everybody, there is people want to see a material gain benefit from a new government, and that would inform how they answer that question. And yeah, like Nicola said, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they can both be congruent with each other.
Suspect, Charlie, if you asked people in Manchester whether they thought Andy Burnham should stand up for Manchester, you get a pretty similar response for the same reasons, actually. So it's maybe just an identity and circumscribed power thing. David, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things, Chris. So there are very good officials in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall who take these matters really seriously and try to sort of shepherd UK government and other colleagues to try and develop more positive intergovernmental relations. As I said earlier, sometimes they can only go as far as their ministers or leaders almost allow them to in their space. So I think that's worth considering in terms of post-May's election. How does the UK government become sort of holder of the ring for these discussions, but also it recognises its role as an actor, and is it acting for the UK as a whole in some? Is it acting as the sort of domestic government, de facto government for England in some? I think there needs to be more clarity in how it engages on those. And I think our polling shows that the public in Scotland and Wales sort of expect it to do that. And the sort of structural ways we approach the way we do cross-nation cooperation across the nations, we need to identify that sort of sharing lessons, so cooperating on major issues need to be the rationale, the objective of the why our governments cooperate. And that's not quite there at the moment. I think that needs to be a part of how all our governments look at these post-May, that the idea of working together on shared problems, so developing mutual understanding between them, is a purpose and a reason why our ministers and leaders do get together, and how they do that. And look at what happens in sort of Canada and Australia, for example, where there is far more flexibility on how the different governments do cooperate on sort of devolved and sort of federal reserved issues, which is something we could learn from in the UK.
Neil Stewart in the chat says it's disappointing to see the disconnect from English regions that have more in common on poverty, health provision, inequality, business hollowing out, etc. So it may be that because these institutions, or the mayoralties, if you like, are still relatively new, that we are still working through how we interact with them. But what is that something that should be done at a devolved governmental level, or is it a city-to-city level or a region-to-region level? How do you see that relationship developing in a fruitful way? Nicola, if you're...
But I don't think it has to be an either or. I think if we it'd be nice if we can move into the sort of mature space where the UK government recognises that it can learn things and from engagement with city regions, with combined authorities, with devolved governments, and vice versa. So that I think there is a concern on the part of the devolved governments, and perhaps it's maybe a little insecurity there, that they don't want to be seen as equivalents to the new devolved administrations within England. And I think it's unfortunate that we are using the same terminology here, because the devolution that has been rolled out in England is very different for all sorts of reasons from the devolution that we have in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So there are some challenges there. I think it's also important to note, though, that in the questions in the survey, there was an awful lot of people who said they didn't know, and that in itself can be an insight into that it's not really high, that these regional devolution is not really high on the awareness of voters in Scotland and Wales.
And in terms of Amelia Webber has a question about, do you think international politics might especially impact the next elections and shift some priorities, the relationship with the EU being a good example? I suppose as another element of that is the sort of next stage of devolution and the right of the Senate and the Welsh government and the Scottish government and Holyrood to act as international actors. And, you know, in a world where foreign policy and international relations is becoming more fraught and more of, you know, it cuts across so many things, of course. And I think you made the point at the start, Nicola, that, you know, reserved and devolved matters cut across each other, and actually both parliaments should be able to talk, or governments should be able to cooperate on these things. Do you think there is or will be in future more of an international role for the devolved parliaments than there maybe has been so far, just given the way politics is changing at the moment? Dewi, if you want to.
Yeah, no, just quickly. Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So as part of our ongoing research into this, and I just mentioned this earlier, we've looked at the Canadian example. So they have sort of longer term structures around intergovernmental relations, but it's been really evident under Mark Carney's premiership. He has convened, I think, 5 meetings of all the provincial first ministers, and the focus has been totally on the relationship with the states, tariffs and trade deals. That is almost unthinkable in a UK context, that the Prime Minister would ask for meetings with the devolved first ministers to help him or her think about the consequences for the UK as a whole in terms of big international issues. And so our recommendation says actually the UK should look to follow more of the Canadian model and bring in sort of the wisdom of the crowd in terms of having the devolved leaders as part of that decision making, because although that might be a reserved issue and Westminster has a certain view about parliamentary sovereignty and how it does things, there's an argument for it, not only in terms of you have greater sort of thinking and understanding from those other leaders, but also clearly knock-on effects in devolved areas from those decisions. So you do need devolved leaders to be part of those conversations. So I think there's a lot to learn from the Canadian approach on these matters.
Nicola, do you want to say anything on that?
I will hold my tongue.
I suppose on the Scottish side of things, though, to not quite let you hold your tongue, you can understand why the UK government is slightly wary about an SNP-led administration having a higher international profile, as they'll see it inevitably as nation building. Is that something that's going to get in the way of, you know, that sort of collaboration?
Probably, and we already know that there are concerns about that. I mean, I suppose a broader point is that it is hard. That kind of engagement is more difficult and challenging in the UK because the UK is not a federation, and we are talking about the smaller constituent parts, and where is the voice for England within that as distinct from the voice for the UK as a whole. So it is tricky, but it also, I think, is a sign that there isn't a federal, not only is there not a federal constitution in the UK, but there isn't really a federal culture or a federal mindset that would lead the UK government to think, what what does the Scottish Government think? What does the Welsh Government think? What, let's bring them in to talk about these issues. Rather, we're still in the space where they think, well, this is a reserved matter. This is a matter for us as the government of the whole of UK to determine. And we know from external relations that there's an awful lot of the sort of we're no longer in a world where you can delineate domestic from international affairs, because so many domestic issues do have an international dimension and an external relations dimension, whether it's in trade, or migration or security or whatever. They do spill over into areas that are devolved responsibilities. So again, I'm hoping for mature relationships post-election, at least for a couple of years.
Ever the optimist. One of the things that Charlie pointed out was that the voting priorities, the voters' priorities, the NHS, cost of living crisis, and immigration are the top three in both Scotland and Wales. Now, we know the immigration debate in England has been raging for many years. It's probably relatively newer as a priority in Scotland, and I'm not sure about Wales, Dewi, whether it's something that's crept up there or it's been more of a debate alongside the English conversation. Obviously, reform doing very well in Wales, and very well to a degree in Scotland as well. Some of it driven by this immigration thing, but certainly given the lack of immigration, one might say, in our countries, why do you think immigration is climbing up the priority list like that? What are the causes for it, and what on earth can a devolved government do about it? Debbie, I don't know if could you?
Yeah, just go quickly. I'm sure Charlie might have something to say. So I think the salience has been quite high in Wales, and you just look at the Brexit patterns there, for example. We haven't got time to go into the interesting demographics in Wales and who it matters more to versus who it doesn't to in their voting patterns. So I think it's not so new in Wales, particularly if you look at how Reform are doing. I think just before handing over to Charlie, I think it's worth mentioning that the polling and wider research also says it's a challenge to devolved governments, that they need a bit of flexibility in working with the UK government on shared issues, and not to jealously guard them as being solely their responsibility. A lot of those issues that matter to the public would benefit from that cross-administration cooperation as well, not simply those reserved issues, but devolved issues as well.
But I can't add too much to that other than the immigration overall across the UK has been steadily rising since Labour came into power, and so it's inevitable, even though that we might understand that there's a distinction between reserved and devolved issues, that nonetheless it bleeds into the politics of Scotland and will be something that voters want to see something done about, even if they're not sure whose responsibility it is or how much power that Holyrood has over it. And this is part of why previously unexpected was Reform now becoming a political threat in Scotland for Labour and the SNP both, which is a more unique situation than they find themselves in England and Wales.
Well, go on.
Sorry, Chris. I don't particularly like these questions about most important issue, because they don't really provide and again, they're very common questions in surveys, Charlie, but they don't give you the context. So in what way is it important? Is it important because you want something done about it to control it, or is it important because you recognise that it's being talked about? And there's also a sort of bit of a chicken and egg thing here with immigration. I think, well, clearly it's being talked about a lot more in politics and among political parties, and that in itself feeds public opinion and is fed by it. So it's really difficult to find the causal link there. With immigration, there's a lot that the devolved governments can do about it, but immigration is one of those issues, a little bit like the constitutional issue, that can be used to frame others. So they're used as a lens through which to discuss and debate other issues. And I think we might start to see that a lot more after the election, with more Reform parliamentarians in the Scottish Parliament and in the Senate, where you will start to sort of see issues like housing or poverty or cost of living or these other areas that are being talked about framed through the lens of the communities that might have priority over certain things. You know, those sorts. So it's the way it interacts with other issues that I think will become part of the debate, a feature of the debate, and one of the challenges for the new administrations.
There's a good question on the chat that voters can only vote for or not vote whoever is on the ballot paper. Given the current lack of faith in politics generally, do the panelists think that a low turnout will be A, likely, and B, harmful? What's your thinking about what turnout will look like? Dewi, you go first.
Well, I think just to carry on the reform question, it's clear part of reform's strategy is to turn out voters who don't traditionally vote, as well as getting them from others. Although in Caerphilly they didn't do as well as you'd expected, they clearly found voters who don't normally vote, and that's the Brexit lesson again, isn't it? So if we extrapolate from that, then potentially high turnout in the Senedd, which would constitute 55-60%, that's not high turnout compared to UK election, might benefit reform. But I think my friends in Plaid Cymru would say, well, they can turn their votes out and get Labour switchers, so they might equally benefit from a high vote, and shows the binary nature of Welsh politics. And reform are likely to occupy those strong oppositional role in Holyrood and the Senedd. And what does that mean for wider intergovernmental relations?
Yeah, I would say that predicting turnout generally is always a challenge. Some things we could keep in mind as we come up to these elections is, as Dewey says, reform's approach here is maybe different to what the Conservatives tend to do, which was they had a sort of reputation of doing better with lower turnouts. And reform strategy is to bring out people who either previously voted in elections gone by and have recently switched off, or people who are otherwise not as engaged. We have seen in some of our polling that a lot of the people who pledge their votes for reform, it's not necessarily from a place of enthusiasm for this party. It's more of a disillusionment with the existing major parties in the Conservatives and Labour and in Scotland, the SNP. But maybe less so, especially for newer converts to reform, less enthusiasm for the party. With that being said, if like reform, I think are saying they want it to be, they want these elections to be a referendum on Labour's performance in government, and in Wales on their performance in the Welsh government, then that might be enough. So again, very hard to say, but there are good reasons for it to be very high or very low.
We're almost out of time, but given we've been talking about a poll today, I did have one sort of last question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Charlie. It feels to me like the polls in Scotland and Wales have been quite settled for a while. They've been telling us roughly the same thing for quite a period of time now. The SNP are going to win in Scotland, Plaid are going to win in Wales, Labour are going to get stuffed in both, and Reform are going to do well in both. So we've got, what did you say it was, Dewi? Is it 70 odd days before we go to the polls?
73, I think, Chris.
73, so that's very precise. Do you think that it's possible that the polls will change much over the next 73 days, given there's been a certain degree of stasis for probably a year, longer than a year? Charlie, you're the polling expert. What do you think?
Well, it's tricky because, as you say, currently we're expecting Labour to suffer quite badly in both. And so what would ordinarily be opportunities in the run-up to an election for things to swing it with what the government does, it's possible that won't have much of an effect if people are already not planning to vote for Labour. It's almost immaterial what the Labour government in Westminster or in Wales do between now and the election. There's not much that can be done to one votes over. So yeah, in that sense, it's hard to see what changes will happen. There are so many questions here. I mean, I think I can't make, as much as maybe our job is trying to read the tea leaves, I can't make predictions about what Keir Starmer will do as his future as Prime Minister. That would shake things up, but we don't know if that will happen before or after the elections in May. So we will keep we're doing lots and lots of polling and focus groups in Scotland and Wales to try and understand the way things have changed in the last year and if we could expect any further changes. But yes, I think by and large things could stay the same. Another thing is there's a Gorton and Denton by-election in Manchester at the moment, which has sucked up the attention of Labour and Reform and the Greens as well. And I think that once that has passed, it could be that attention shift and then more vocal campaigning is being done, and that could shake out the results a little bit. That could change how people intend to vote. But again, we'll see. We'll keep tracking these things and we'll keep publishing results.
Nicola, when we're talking about Scotland, Labour's fabled ground machine, its fabled social media presence, its the resources it claims that it has, is there any chance of a last-minute comeback?
Well, I think campaigns matter, and we, you and I, Chris, will remember 2011, where it was quite late on when the polls began to shift in the SNP's favour. However, it is difficult to see from this vantage point where the big changes would come in Scotland. I don't make predictions either. I'm quite happy to interpret polls as they come. But I think that, let's see how people perform. And there can be events that take place or things that intervene that were unexpected, that might make a difference. Well, yeah, and you, on your point about turnout earlier, that will probably make a difference. And it's probably worth remembering that in Scotland there are an awful lot of marginal constituencies. Now that might not have the effect that it would have were it a Westminster election because of the relationship with the regional list vote being shaped by what happens at the constituency level. I'm fascinated to see what the outcome of the Welsh election is with the new electoral system, and whether it is as expected or whether it presents some anomalies that were unintended.
Debbie, the last word to you, since you paid for the poll, not personally.
Just to pick up on Nicola's points, yeah, the new electoral system in Wales means it's very difficult to predict voting behaviour. It's proportional, it's completely new constituencies. There's one party none of us have mentioned, which is the Greens. Now, they have experience of being in government in Scotland. How's that going to play out? They've never even been in a Senedd in Wales. They could be in coalition, potentially, with Plaid. That's very interesting from a cross-nation comparative view and the role they might play on these IGR relations. And just more widely, very happy to keep the conversation going. Catherine, Head of External Affairs and Policy-Wise, has posted the link to our analysis. And I'm sure More in Common have more information as well. Very happy to keep the conversation going on any of these matters.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us. Not long to go now. So there'll be plenty more events over the coming 73 days and beyond. So we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you all again for those conversations. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.